On behalf of the Institute of Advanced Studies and Loughborough University, it is my great pleasure today to be welcoming one of our IAS residential fellows, JC Gaillard, who has come to us from New Zealand. He will have a fulsome welcome from Ksenia Chmutina, whom I always kind of botch badly, so I'll have to say apologies in advance when I say your name. But Ksenia is going to be giving a proper introduction because Ksenia and JC have been working together for some time as collaborators, but also we have had the pleasure of hosting once for a very short visit a couple of years ago, JC, and now for this much longer visit for the possibilities of continuing this collaboration. And it's something we really look forward to, and we are really thrilled to have you back. And also, of course, a very long delayed, COVID delayed visit back to us. So we are, again, very, very delighted to be able to welcome you back to the space. Residential fellowships are something that we were incredibly keen to get off the ground here at the IAS a few years ago. They coincided pretty much perfectly with the pandemic. So we are now thrilled that they are really coming thick and fast again. And we are both welcoming colleagues who delayed their visits to us, but decided to maintain that connection with us, and also some new colleagues who will be coming in the new year. So we are thrilled to be able to continue that process today. Ksenia, I'm going to turn over to you at this point to have more direct introduction, and then we'll welcome you.
Super. Thank you. Thank you so much, Marcia. Oh, no feedback. Hopefully you can hear me. Great. Hi, everyone. I'm so sorry I can't join you in IS in person today. I really wish I was there. COVID bound, hopefully beyond bound soon. But it's my absolute pleasure, and I'm so excited to finally introduce JC. After 2 years of COVID delays, finally, JC here in IS with us. And as Marcia mentioned, JC has already visited Loughborough for a couple of years, just before the pandemic. And clearly liked it so much that he decided to return, and it's great. Thank you. So a formal introduction. JC Gaillard is a professor of geography at the University of Auckland in New Zealand, and his work focuses on power and inclusion in disaster studies. It includes developing participatory tools for engaging minority groups in disaster risk reduction, with an emphasis on ethnic and gender minorities, prisoners, children, and homeless people. And also, like JC likes Lego. We spend a lot of time playing Lego together, but less formally, really. JC is a fantastic colleague and a close friend who really challenges the normative aspects of disaster studies. And I've been so lucky to be able to work with JC on all sorts of weird and wonderful things. So without any further ado, over to you, JC, and to all of you in the room. Enjoy. This is going to be fun.
Good afternoon, everyone. Kira Koto, I'm sorry, I tried to look at all the items at the same time. It's a bit complex, but thank you so much, Ksenia and Marcia, for the nice word of introduction and for hosting me here this month. And it's been fantastic. Even the weather has been very welcoming, which is, for someone who grew up in France, very unlikely to expect in the UK. So this is very nice. What I want to do is to discuss some challenges we are facing in disaster studies. And I want to start as suggested in the title of the talk on a book recently published entitled The Invention of Disasters. But I kind of want to focus more on the future than reflecting back on the book. I think it's important to move on, and I have moved on anyway. I'm here to try to spend some time writing proposals with Ksenia, writing what is hopefully the pitch for the sequel of this book. That leads me to two caveats, I think, to preface my talk. The first one is that because I'm still trying to get my head around many of these issues I want to develop in the sequel of the book, Everything is still bubbling in my mind, kind of boiling, so it's still very much work of reflection progress. And I have notes, which is very, very unlikely or unexpected for me when I give a talk, but it's so kind of messy in my mind that I really need something to hand on at the moment, and I really look forward to this opportunity to interact with you all online and here to get some feedback and some more ideas to expand my thoughts and strengthen my thoughts for this sequel. The second caveat is that if you are very familiar with postcolonial studies, especially literary studies, there won't be much new in what I'm going to tell you. It's probably been around for probably 40 years or 50 years, but our field of disaster scholarship has long been dominated by physical sciences, and those kind of ideas do not get much traction or haven't gotten much traction yet. And I think this is why I'm trying to push in this direction at the moment. But before we get to move on with the core of what I want to tell you, I want to start with I want to start with one quote by the Martinican novelist, poet, and philosopher Edward Wilson. I know it's very famous in Northern America, maybe not so much here in the UK. It's not definitely in Australasia and the Pacific, but it's probably the foremost contemporary, although he passed a few years ago, but the foremost contemporary postcolonial thinker in let's say, France, but what is writing in French. And my argument later on is going to be informed by Glison's philosophy. So I want to start by one quote, which I think summarizes the main question we have to ask ourselves while moving on with our scholarship on disasters in the decades to come. And this is somehow a very simple question. I think that the wording may be a bit more convoluted, but it's a very simple question. It's about our positionality and how we reach out and listen to the others. And it's about how we can open up ourselves without losing who we are. And I think this is a very nice quote that informs what I'm going to tell you. And I want you to start off with to reflect upon this quote. So what I have prepared is a very short Menti quiz. So if you're familiar, you can log in into menti.com. Menti is like Vivox, we're using more Vivox, I think, in the UK. In New Zealand, we were probably a bit back behind and we use Menti. We still use Socrates, which is pretty much archaic, I think. So, but this is the same thing as Vivox, basically a quiz. It's a word cloud in that particular case. So if you could log in menti.com and use the 8-digit code here, or use the let me see, yeah, this is the direct link in the chat, or you can use the QR code. I know students love QR codes now. So you can just scan the QR code, it should take you to the poll. And the poll is basically about answering this question.
Apologies, can I spot over your mic?
Oh, sure. Well, that's very fancy. Okay, is it good?
I've got an echo. Awesome. Okay, so the quiz is basically about answering the question, Glison's question. And interestingly, I ran the same poll last week for a talk, an online talk in Durham. And I got very much the same words that are showing up on the screen here: humility, an ability to listen to someone else, to share. We have 15 people on the call, so there should be a few more. We're at 4, 5. You can write in 3 answers, I think, each. Humility, confidence, that's an interesting one. Independence, humility again, empathy came up last week as well, which is interesting. An ability for dialogue, to be open to a dialogue, and this is a word I'm going to use quite strongly afterwards. Security, compassion, interesting. Openness, obviously awareness to the other, I guess. Oh, so many words popping up now. Relationality, I'm going to use that quite a lot afterwards, how we can relate to the others. Security, communication, openness, ability to listen again, and participate. So awesome. I'm going to use probably some of these words afterwards to build my argument. And what I'm going to do is to squeeze the Menti slide into the slideshow, the PowerPoint. And if you want to share it, Kieran, afterwards with the audience, we can do that, that we have a trace of all these very good words. So this is fantastic. Now I want to carry on and probably move on with my argument. So maybe returning to the book, The Invention of Disaster. The book stems from a very simple observation, which is that in disaster scholarship at large, we probably, not all, but almost all of us now would claim that disasters are social constructs. But at the same time, we use concepts, theories, methodologies that we take for universal, and we roll them out all around the world as if they were going to help us understand the experiences of millions of people across very different cultures and societies. And these words, these concepts, these theories and methodologies are, for a very, very large majority of them, informed by Western ontologies and Western epistemologies. And by the West here, I use it with caution, but I very much like how Glissant uses the term, which is more as a project, an imperialist project, and not as a location, a region in the world per se. It's more a project of expanding and conquering the world. And this is in this sense that I use it. So that kind of tension seems antithetical to me. I mean, this is what I call the epistemological nonsense of disaster studies. How can we take something for universal, but at the same time try to unpack social construct? There seems to be a problem there. That's the observation of the book, and I try in the book to explain how we've ended up with such an epistemological nonsense. Trying to trace back the origin of these this hegemony, as I call it in the book, and try to explain as well, or try to explore how this hegemony of Western paradigms and ultimately discourses, because all these theories, concepts, and methodologies underpin different paradigms and different discourses, but all bound still within a Western understanding of the world, and I'll return to that in a moment. And how these Western discourses have informed very normative policies, actions to reduce disaster risk, or what we call disaster risk, at least in the West. And the mechanisms behind that kind of hegemony in discourses, but as well in actions and policies. So that's the starting point and the kind of main argument of the book. So we have this kind of universal set of tools, theoretical and methodological, that we use to explore disasters across very diverse cultures and societies. And this is even more, I mean, puzzling, somehow challenging, because how can we be so normative to study something which, beyond the cultural differences and whether the concept of disaster may actually make sense in other places in the world, because we can't translate these terms, I mean, with disaster or vulnerability, all the jargon we use in many different languages. But beyond just this kind of epistemological issue, there's an ontological issue, I think, which is that how can we be normative with something which is by nature so subjective? A disaster is by nature our subjective interpretation of harm, of hardship, of damage. And we've long struggled to pinpoint that where is the threshold in harm? Where is the threshold in hardship? Where is the threshold in damage that makes that we move into a situation which is called a disaster? So that's the D's in the aster, the prefix D's, and I'll return to the prefix in a moment. And it seems to me that most of our efforts from a theoretical perspective over the past century almost has been to normalize that threshold, which by nature to me can't be normalized because it's a subjective interpretation of the world and of our bodies. So we've focused on normalizing this, and here I'm using a definition by one of the most famous definitions by one of the pioneer sociologists in the field, Charles Fritz, in the 1960s, and he clearly refers to normal expectations in life. So this is all about this normative expectation of what is acceptable hardship, what is acceptable harm, what is acceptable damage, beyond which it becomes a disaster. And if I return to the argument of the book, The Invention of Disaster, the problem is that beyond just, again, the terminology and epistemological issues, the expectations of life, of harm, of hardship that have driven of our agenda have been set after an understanding of the world which is inherited from Europe's 18th century and the Enlightenment, basically. So we often use the 1755 Lisbon earthquake as turning point of how we've been dealing with disasters, but I think it's a broader change in terms of how we saw the world in the 18th century or late 17th, early 19th century in Europe especially, and how it became unacceptable for some natural phenomena to prevent people to flourish in life. And obviously I'm focusing here on disasters associated with natural phenomena, but it became then unacceptable that nature could prevent people to flourish in life. It's all about life. And in disaster studies, we talk a lot about hardship, harm, damage, death, etc., and not too much about life, but it's all about life. It's all about normative interpretations of life. And so this heritage of the 19th century that coincided in many ways with the imperialist project of the West, and we return to this idea of the West as a project, was rolled out all around the world. Again, hoping that it will help us understand how people make sense of their own lives in very, very different cultures. And that, to me, that can't work. There's no such a thing as a disaster in the first place. Again, it's a subjective interpretation of the world. And it's very similar. This process has been very similar to how we've been dealing with diseases and mental disorders. So in the book, especially in the conclusion, I use, I rely extensively on the philosophy of Georges Canguilhem, the French philosopher and doctor. For those who don't know him, he was Bourdieu's supervisor, and he was in the panel of Foucault's PhD for his Viva as well. So he's a very prominent French thinker, not so much, I think, in the Anglophone world. He's been translated, but not so prominent probably. But he talked a lot about how we have set the similar normative expectations about what life is, and where we should set threshold, or where the society has set threshold to define what a disease is in terms of physiological criteria. But there's no such a thing as a fever as such, for example. It's our interpretation of our body temperature. Where does a fever start for you, Monia, and for me? I mean, maybe it starts at 38 for you, maybe it starts at 39 for me. But I mean, if you look at the international classification of diseases, for example, that changes all the time. I think there are 11 versions now or something. It changes. They change the kind of physiological criteria they use. Same thing for the DSM and mental disorders. It changes all the time. What is acceptable behavior changes throughout time. It's exactly the same process for disasters. And we've tried to normalize this process and these definitions either qualitatively by trying to come up with standard definitions. I'm going to return to how in the 1990s and 2000 our field has been obsessed with glossaries in many different languages to impose standard definitions but it's been as well in quantitative ways. Look at how our databases in the field are so important and how we set a threshold, for example, at 100% killed as a limit for a disaster to occur. Why 99? Why not 99? Why not 101, for example? It's a purely normative kind of threshold that doesn't reflect any, as Derrida would say, I mean, transcendental signifier. There's nothing behind a disaster. And I'm not saying that you need to differ as well the understanding of what a disaster is to the understanding of other concepts, like what vulnerability is, what harm is, what the hazard is, etc., etc. This is another question I don't want to explore too much here, but I want to move on. So the point here is that there's no such a thing as a universal understanding of what a disaster is, and henceforth there can't be any universal ways of exploring or researching what a disaster is, if ever the concept makes any sense in the first place across cultures and societies. So the point here is that there can't be any more meta-narrative, and I think this is where I close the book, and this is where I want to pick up on now to try to expand that and try to expand the agenda I suggest in the conclusion of the book. So we need basically other narratives to emerge, and we need to recognize that there may be other ways of understanding what harm and hardship is across different cultures and societies. And I'm not saying that the way we understand it in the West is specific to the West. There may be other similar perspectives elsewhere in the world. But we need to open up our mind and to listen, as many of you said in your words earlier, and to be open to this possibility of otherness beyond one very normative understanding of what a disaster is. And that leads to think that there may be other ways of understanding the world, but as well different modes of existence, if we want to use Latour's terminology, or even in terms of research or creation of knowledge, different epistemes in Foucault's sense. So it's all about opening ourselves to different ontologies and epistemologies about the world, and possibly about harm and hardship, and eventually disaster, if the concept make any sense. So we need to be open to this otherness, this idea of other understandings of the world, with empathy, as you said, with honesty, and with a commitment to hopefully no hierarchical understanding of these different ways of understanding the world. Being open to difference without, and that's a challenge, I know, but I'm going to hopefully try to provide some ways forward afterwards. And Glissant has provided some ways forwards for sure. We need to be open to otherness, to difference, without thinking in terms of hierarchy, in terms of one perspective being better than the other. And I'm going to give you one quick example from my region in the Philippines, where the sequel of the book is going to focus on. So if we look at nowadays, I mean, people will understand the word disasters and associate disasters to natural hazards for sure. But if we look at early dictionaries and glossaries and vocabularies by the Spanish friars in the late 16th, early 17th centuries, you would never find anything negative in the wording of definitions of floods, of cyclones, of volcanic ash. It's rather a positive thing, because the flood was bringing water to till rice, basically. So obviously the Spanish friars at the time had their own agenda and their own way of translating. But the thing is that the only dangers that appear in these vocabularies are crocodiles, that have unfortunately disappeared now, and other people. So these were considered like threats, not floods, not ashfall, not cyclones. So it's about opening up ourselves to other things that may be challenges in life and causes of hardship, and that may fall completely outside of disaster studies at the moment. I'm not saying that they are not threats to other people, but if you take the issue of crocodiles and wildlife, I mean, this is a major threat to many people in the world at the moment. I mean, in Aussie or in southern Africa for crocodiles, for example, but never fall within any disaster risk reduction agenda. because this is not considered a threat from our perspective. So one caveat here again, I'm not advocating for any form of relativism here, especially if relativism is, as the Ghanaian philosopher Wiredu would say, if it's something that leads to shutting off any opportunity for dialogue. I would say no, because it's all going to be about dialogue. So we don't want to say this is all different, all relative, so we can't talk because we don't understand each other. No, that's not the point at all. And I'm not saying as either that everything is going to be true. In Latour's sense, there will be some very unique, different ways of validating what is true and what is not. So it's not either being relativist in that perspective. Another caveat is that, and I'm very concerned that some people may pick up on this in the conclusion of the book. Hopefully not, but I'm not trying to advocate for any form of essentialism as well, and I'm not trying to essentialize the other at all. Nor am I trying to romanticize some form of nativism, because it's not what it is all around the world. Our understandings of disaster, we have to be realistic, are likely to be hybrid or creole or creolized. They are likely to be informed by different interactions with otherness, with different understanding of the world. And we operate within this very normative, again, policy and action set up for disaster risk reduction. Everyone in the world now is so kind of embedded within this Western mindset that it's there. But my take is that it's there coexisting with other understandings of the world. So I'm not saying here that hybridity and creolization are some form of integration or blending or fusion of different understandings of the world. I'm not talking about pidgin in linguistics here. I'm talking about the combined uses and combined understanding of the world that inform how people ultimately make decisions and deal with hardship and harm. So it's more, I mean, to take Baba's definition of hybridity somehow, it's more sort of a form of resistance to how colonial power has been imposed upon people, and how normative injunctions about life have been imposed upon people. And I'm going to give you another example here from the very same place in the Philippines. So we use the word disaster. I mean, English national language. The government has been very good at imposing this performative discourse on disasters using these very Western concepts and using them in English, because again, many of the paperwork is in English. So we use disaster, and people will understand disaster as probably we do in the West. But most people would use in everyday life the word sakuna, and sakuna is a Sanskrit word. So when I talk about creolization or hybridization, it's not only about things that came from colonization in the West, it's things that may predate colonial heritages as well in some places in the world. Here it's a Sanskrit heritage that came from trade with pre-colonial India, probably. And the word sakuna in Sanskrit means bird of omen. It's not the same thing as a disaster as we understand it in the West. But that's a second word. At the same time, we use calamidad, Spanish. The Philippines were under Spanish rules for 300 years before being under Hollywood rules for 50 years. Sorry, Marcia. So we use the word calamidad as well, as in Spanish. Although in our field in Spanish, we would use desastre more often than calamidad, but we use calamidad, and people understand calamidad. People use calamidad, which is more or less the same understanding as what a disaster is, because it's the same kind of European heritage. But it's a third word, and there's a fourth one, which is the Austronesian indigenous word, which is taku or katakuan. Probably very, very few people across the region will understand the word taku now. But it's in the very early Spanish dictionaries. Even the early American missionaries in the early 1900s mention the word. So there's this word taku that refers to misfortune, kind of misfortune. So something negative happening to you that may be associated with your with yourself, and the loss of pride somehow, something that we find all across the Austronesian world in the Pacific as well, and in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So it's a very different thing. So we have 4 different words that are used kind of next to each other with different nuances in terms of the origin of harm, the origin of hardship, not used exactly in the same context, but the same people. So it's all kind of coexisting together. And to give you another example, by the way, of how there's no such a thing as a disaster. So we use sakuna, the word Sanskrit in the Philippines, but in Indonesia, in Bahasa, they use bencana, which is another Sanskrit word that means trickery. It's a very different thing. So in the 2 countries, neighbors, with the same Austronesian heritage, we use 2 Sanskrit words that mean very different things. And in India now, they use different words as well. They use apada and vipati that mean other things. So there's obviously no such a thing as a disaster, whether in our own languages or when we learn words from other languages. So we definitely need to come up with some sort of pluralistic approaches, ontologies, epistemologies to understand what disasters are. And by pluralism, I mean many different others, but as well many different hybrid others, which heritages come from multiple sources, directions, legacies. So this is one thing. Now, because these heritages are multiple, we need to consider these understandings of what possibly a disaster are, hardship and harm are, in a relational perspective through a dialogue. And this is where your words up front were super interesting and important, because you refer to relationships, or relationality, and dialogue. We can't work in a silo, and this is why this is not an essentialist kind of perspective, because we can't close ourselves onto our own perspectives, because our own perspectives are always kind of influenced by others. And this is why Glissant's question I asked up front is so important. It's about opening ourselves to others without losing who we are. But this needs to happen in this kind of leveled field. The relationships need to be based on, as you said, empathy, an ability to listen, and no hierarchy again. And that means, and that's one of the main challenges, but this is definitely a way forward at the same time. We need to recognize that if we want to play on a level pitch, and if we want to recognize otherness, we will not understand everything about the others. That's something which is super important. Things will be opaque, to use one of Glissant's key concepts, opacity. Things will necessarily be opaque. We won't be understanding everything about the world, and we won't be able to standardize anything. And opacity will be a challenge for us in disaster studies, because as I said early on, especially I think in the 1990s and 2000s, but probably a bit less now, we were obsessed with glossaries and trying to come up with standard definitions for everything, if it's not standard numbers for thresholds. I think in my office, I may have 3, 4, 5 glossaries by the UN and different committees worldwide. It can't happen. I mean, translation in that context is inherently an act of reduction. We force something into someone else's perspective, and it's a violent act of reduction. And I think we have to be very, very concerned about this and very open to the fact that we won't understand everything. We can't translate everything. And this is why with Xenia and others, we're trying to encourage people to publish in more than just English, French, Spanish, or Portuguese. We need to be able to publish in more languages to better capture otherness, but still in a perspective which is in a dialogue. It's not about closing ourselves. It's still about being open. And this is, again, Glissant's kind of tricky question upfront. How do we do that? How do we navigate that ability to open ourselves without losing ourselves? So it's about, I mean, to use Senghor, the former leader of the liberation movement, the decolonization movement in Africa, and former Senegalese president, the first president post-independence. He was talking about thinking for oneself and by oneself, but not shutting ourselves to the others either. So it's for us and by us, but still being open to the others. And being open to the others means as well that we are not suggesting that we should throw everything out of the window, all Western concepts out of the window. We can't do that. Again, in the Philippines, we use the word disaster. We have to be realistic. We still operate within an academic environment which is however we want it. I mean, it's Western. And the very fact that I'm talking here as part of some sort of disaster studies environment, I mean, we're still dealing with disasters however we want it. And that's why, I mean, it can't be a relativist agenda or nativist agenda. I mean, we still operate within that system. So we have to, or we can't throw everything out of the window, but when we use, and that's the key point, when we use concepts like disasters, when we use methods that we borrow from a European heritage, we always have to contest and challenge how they are used, what they mean in other contexts. So it's not about abandoning everything, it's about not taking anything for granted or common sense. It's always challenging. And if you take Derrida, for example, he will always say, no, we need the concepts because they allow us to actually challenge them and challenge the status quo at the moment. If we were to throw them out of the window, I mean, we wouldn't have anything to start off with. So we need to use them, but always challenge and contest them, especially when they are used outside of their cadre somehow. And I think this is an important point. And this will allow us ultimately to capture the world as a whole. And that's Glissant's concept of tout monde. I'm not too sure that the English translation, which is whole world with an hyphen, is the best translation for what he means in French. But probably the best word in English, but it's about looking at the whole world, but not from a universal monolithic perspective, but from a pluralistic perspective where things are not isolated. So they come as a whole, but because of these relationships and processes of hybridization and creolization. And I think this is important. We are still looking at the whole picture, but not as a monolithic universal, or from a monolithic and universal perspective. And I think this is important. And that's why I like the Glissant's concept of tout monde, or whole world, because I think that captures the challenges that we face. And I would like to close, because time is flying, with just a few key pathways probably for what Glissant called his archipelagic approach to understanding the world. And these 5 key pathways summarize Glissant's philosophy very well, and I think they summarize my previous points quite nicely as well. So it's all about this. He uses the word pensée in French, pensée du tremblement, so translated in English as thought of trembling. Monia, it should make more sense in Italian probably, but trembling in the sense that nothing is set in stone. Things change through time, through these different processes of hybridization, creolization, influences from different heritages, globalization nowadays. So things are never set in stone. Things change, things tremble all the time. But they tremble largely because things are fluid in space. And Glissant, at least in Francophone, French geography especially, has made a big contribution recently. He's been read by many geographers, not yet in the Anglophone geography, which is a shame. But it's very spatial. He talks about space, about landscape, about natural hazards everywhere in his books, both the novels and the essays. And so it's about wandering, which is the official translation for la pensée de l'errance in French. Some people say that errantry in English, which is closer to the French errance, is better. My English doesn't allow me to gauge the difference between errantry and wandering, but it's all about capturing that kind of fluidity in space. So it's fluid in time, that's the trembling, and it's fluid in space as well, because things get across places and influence themselves. And all of this kind of creates that creolization of the world. And we need to think in terms of Creole perspective. So Glissant doesn't like the word hybridity. I personally like it in the way Baba uses it. as a form of resistance, because it allows us to capture unequal power relations as well as a form of resistance. But we need to capture that kind of hybrid Creole understanding of the world. And that will force us to be open to opacity. I think this is a key pathway. We can't understand everything, and that's fine. That's absolutely fine. And this is only through this pathway that we will have some dialogue or some fair, genuine, grounded relationships across all of us researchers of disaster studies and beyond. Because again, what a disaster is will be subjective, and we will need more people to join in. But the dialogue, the relationship that you mentioned in your words are absolutely crucial here. Again, it's not essentializing anything. It's not about nativism. It's about opening ourselves without losing who we are. And I close off here with one later quote by Glissant, which believes, and I think he was an optimistic, and I'm an optimistic as well, that it was possible to open oneself to the other without losing who we are. And I think this is a nice nice quote to close off the seminar. And I'm very sorry I've been a bit over time. I'm not sure if we can stay beyond 2 p.m. for more questions, but over to you for questions now. Xenia or Marcia, I'm not too sure who wants to take over.